I was told the man jumped because he was tired. Tired of drinking, tired of guilt, tired of living with what he knew. That's what the report said. Clean, simple, final. But 10 years after his body was pulled from the river, I noticed something no one else had bothered to question. Every document describing his final week had been rewritten twice, and every rewrite made his death easier to accept. People kill themselves for many reasons, but paperwork doesn't lie unless someone needs it to. I was already retired when the file landed on my desk. Not officially. Not with a badge or a case number attached. Just a thin folder slid across a diner table by a man who still believed paperwork could fix what time had buried. It was late October, one of those nights where the rain doesn't fall. It hangs. Streetlights blurred into long yellow smears on the windshield, and the city felt half asleep, like it didn't want to know what was still awake inside it. The man across from me worked for the state now. Oversight Division. He didn't say that part out loud. He didn't have to. "You ever hear of Leonard Cross?" he asked. I shook my head. The name didn't ring. That alone was strange. I remember most names, even the quiet ones. "He was a municipal engineer," the man said, 10 years ago. "Jumped off the Harrow Bridge." I looked down at the folder. No blood, no drama, just typed pages and a clipped police summary. Cause of death, suicide, alcohol in system. No signs of struggle. Case closed. "That's it?" I asked. The man hesitated, long enough to answer a different question. "That's what's on paper." That was how it started. I didn't open the file until I got home. Old habit. I like to let things sit with me first. See if they make noise of their own. Some cases do. They hum low and steady like a refrigerator in a dark kitchen. This one stayed quiet. Leonard Cross, 46 years old at the time of death, divorced, no kids, lived alone in a rented house near the river. Drank more than his doctor liked, less than the report implied. He'd been found early morning by a delivery driver. Wallet on him. Watch still ticking. No note. The bridge was high enough to do the job. The river wide, slow, unforgiving. If you jumped there, you meant it. That's what everyone agreed on. I read the witness statements first. 2 joggers. A security guard stationed 100 yards away. All said the same thing. A man standing alone, looking down, then gone. No one heard shouting. No one saw a struggle. Clean. But I've learned something over the years. Clean scenes aren't comforting. They're suspicious. I flipped to the timeline. Leonard Cross had been scheduled to give a deposition 3 days later. Civil inquiry, infrastructure failure, a dam project outside the city, cost overruns, material substitutions, a partial collapse during spring runoff that killed 2 maintenance workers. Cross had signed off on the final safety inspection. He was also the only engineer whose name appeared on every revision of the project. That didn't mean guilt, it meant responsibility. And responsibility has a way of making people nervous. I leaned back in my chair and lit a cigarette I didn't need. Smoke curled up toward the ceiling, slow and patient. The kind of smoke that gives you time to think. If you were Leonard Cross and you knew something ugly was about to surface, what would you do? That was my first assumption. Fear, guilt, a man choosing the river over a courtroom. It was a comfortable theory, the kind everyone prefers. I kept reading. Police photos. Grainy. Black and white. The bridge at dawn. Wet concrete. A pair of scuffed dress shoes near the railing. Too neat. People don't usually line up their shoes before they die. They kick them off. They stumble out of them. Or they fall with them on. I made a note. The toxicology report came next. Elevated blood alcohol, high enough to blur judgment, low, enough to walk straight. Then I saw the date. The report had been amended. Once, 2 days after the autopsy. Again, a week later. That bothered me more than the alcohol. I checked the signatures. Same medical examiner. Same typed name. But the second amendment adjusted the time of death by nearly an hour. The third clarified Leonard's mental state based on newly obtained personal history. No source listed. Paperwork doesn't shift like that unless someone leans on it. Stay with me until the end. The truth behind this case still unsettles me. The next morning I drove out to the bridge. It was still there. Same rust-stained railings, same slow water sliding underneath like it had all the time in the world. Trucks thundered past without slowing, carrying things that mattered more than memory. I stood where Leonard Cross was supposed to have stood. You could see the city from there, the good parts and the tired ones, the kind of view that makes a man think or decide. The security booth sat off to the side. Empty now, but 10 years ago there'd been a guard on duty. I tracked him down later that day. Name was Harold Metz, retired. Lived in a 1-story house that smelled like dust and old coffee. He remembered Leonard, said he'd talked to him briefly that night. About what? I asked. Metz scratched his chin. Nothing important. Weather, river level. He asked what time my shift ended. That wasn't in the original report. What would you have done in my place? I asked Metz why he hadn't mentioned the conversation before. He looked at the floor. No one asked. That was my second assumption, breaking down. Back home, I spread the documents across my table. The deposition notice, the engineering reports, the amendments, all neat, all polite, all arranged to tell the same story. Leonard Cross was tired. Leonard Cross was guilty. Leonard Cross chose the river. But something was missing. People who plan to end their lives usually simplify. They cancel things. They stop correcting details. Leonard Cross had revised a structural calculation the morning of his death, signed it, time-stamped it, emailed it to a colleague. It fixed a flaw, not a big one, but a real one. Men who are about to die don't fix small problems. Before I tell you what happened next, please consider subscribing. It truly helps keep these stories alive. I went to Leonard's old office building that afternoon. City-owned now, half the lights out, long corridors that echoed your footsteps whether you wanted them to or not. I found his former supervisor, a careful man, gray suit, precise smile. He was under a lot of pressure, the supervisor said. The dam, the inquiry, the media. Did he ever talk about harming himself? I asked. The supervisor paused. Not directly. That word again. Did anyone suggest he should? The smile tightened. I don't understand the question. That was answer enough. When I left, rain had started falling in earnest. Heavy drops, loud, honest. The kind of rain that doesn't pretend to be anything else. I sat in my car and looked at the file again. Leonard Cross hadn't jumped because he was tired. He jumped because he'd been cornered. I just didn't know yet who had built the walls or how many people had helped hold them up. What would you have done in my place? I drove home slowly, windshield wipers struggling to keep up, and felt the weight of the case settle in, not like urgency, like inevitability. Because once you start asking why a death was made easy to accept, you're no longer investigating a man. You're investigating a system, and systems don't like being questioned. If Leonard Cross had jumped because he was guilty, the pressure would have come from inside. But pressure like that leaves fingerprints, missed appointments, sloppy work, loose ends. Leonard had left none. I started with the people who'd worked closest to him in the last year of his life. Engineers don't disappear socially when they're spiraling. They disappear administratively. They get cut out of meetings, taken off email chains, quietly sidelined. That pattern was all over the damn project. 3 months before his death, Leonard stopped being copied on design revisions. Not officially, no memo, just a gradual absence. His name stayed on the documents, but his comments stopped appearing in the margins. Someone had decided he didn't need to speak anymore. I drove out to the dam the next morning. It sat an hour outside the city, concrete and steel pressed into a narrow valley, holding back a wide, patient body of water. The kind of structure that looks permanent right up until it fails. The collapse site had been repaired years ago. Fresh concrete, new railings, a plaque for the 2 men who died. Their names were engraved cleanly, as if clarity could make up for timing. I walked the perimeter with a site manager who hadn't been there during the original construction. Young, careful. He talked the way people do when they know the history, but not the guilt. The official cause was unexpected soil movement, he said. Freeze-thaw cycle. Rare conditions. Rare doesn't mean impossible, I said. No, he agreed. Just unlikely. What would you have done in my place? He didn't answer. He just stared out over the water where the surface looked calm enough to believe lies. Back in the city, I tracked down Leonard's former drinking buddy. Not a close friend, just a man who'd shared enough evenings with him to notice changes. They used to meet at a bar near the river, still there, same dim lighting, same smell of old wood and spilled liquor. Leonard's friend sat in a corner booth, hands wrapped around a coffee like it might escape. He stopped talking, the man said. That's what scared me. About the job. About everything. Like he was afraid words might count as decisions. That stuck with me. People under normal stress complain. They vent. They look for allies. Leonard had gone quiet. I asked about the drinking. He drank, the man said. But he always drank. That wasn't new. What was new was him checking the door every time it opened. That wasn't in the file. I went back to the autopsy reports that night. Read them slowly, line by line. The alcohol level was consistent with a man who'd had a few drinks over several hours. Not a binge, not oblivion. Enough to take the edge off. Not enough to surrender control. Then I noticed something else. Leonard had bruising on his forearm, faint, listed as likely incidental. I've seen incidental bruises. This wasn't one of them. It was the shape that bothered me. Fingers. 4 of them, tight enough to leave a mark, gentle enough to pass without comment. Someone had held him. Not pushed, not dragged, just steadied. I went looking for Leonard's family next. There wasn't much. An ex-wife living 2 states away. They hadn't spoken in years, but she remembered the call she'd gotten the night before he died. He asked me if people ever pay for things they didn't break, she said. What did you tell him? That they usually pay for what's easiest to pin on them. She laughed when she said it, then stopped. What would you have done in my place? She told me Leonard had sounded calm. Not resolved, not panicked, just careful. Like a man choosing his words because someone might be listening. I asked if he'd mentioned suicide. No, she said. He asked if starting over was cowardly. That wasn't a man preparing to die. That was a man calculating the cost of staying. The deeper I went, the clearer the shape became. No threats, no explicit orders, no midnight phone calls telling Leonard what to do. Instead, there were meetings where he wasn't invited, files that arrived already finalized, subtle reminders of professional liability, conversation about pensions, about reputations, about how investigations have a way of widening once they start. Pressure without hands. I requested the internal memos from the civil inquiry Leonard was supposed to testify in. Most of them were gone, purged under standard retention policy. But one survived, a scheduling email from the lead counsel sent 2 weeks before Leonard's death. Subject line: Deposition Scope Clarification. It outlined what Leonard would and wouldn't be asked, which areas were outside the inquiry's focus, which answers might create unnecessary complications. Leonard had replied with a single sentence: "I can't answer selectively without misrepresenting the facts." After that, there were no more emails from him. That was when the case shifted for me. Up until then, I'd been treating Leonard as a potential victim of circumstance, a man crushed by his own conscience. Now I saw him as a problem that needed resolving. I went the bridge at night. Traffic thinned after midnight. The river reflected the lights in long, broken lines. I stood near the railing and imagined a man weighing options that weren't really options at all. If Leonard testified fully, the inquiry would widen. Careers would end. Lawsuits would follow. The dam might be deemed unsafe. The city would bleed money it didn't have. If Leonard stayed silent, the lie would hold. If Leonard disappeared, the problem solved itself. I checked the security logs again. The guard on duty had taken a scheduled break 10 minutes before Leonard went over the edge. Logged, approved, routine. Too routine. I asked the guard who approved it. He told me the name without hesitation. A supervisor who'd been promoted 6 months after the incident. "What would you have done in my place?" I paid the supervisor a visit the next day. Office with a view. Polished desk. Framed commendations. He spoke carefully. Every sentence trimmed of excess. "No one wanted Leonard harmed," he said. "That's important to understand." "I'm trying," I replied. "He was unstable." "In what way?" "He took things personally." "So he was inconvenient." The supervisor's jaw tightened, just for a second. "We were concerned about the scope of damage," he said, "about what could happen if partial truths were presented as full ones." Partial truths. That was the phrase they liked. Made lies sound responsible. I asked if anyone had suggested Leonard step away. Take time. Leave town. The supervisor leaned back. People made observations about stress, about health, and about what happens to whistleblowers. Silence. That was my point of no return. After that, I couldn't treat this as a closed case with loose ends. It was an active design. A structure built to remove a man without committing a crime. No threats. No violence. Just narrowing corridors until the exit looked like relief. I went home that night and wrote everything down. Not in a report, in a notebook. Names, dates, phrases people used when they didn't want to say what they meant. I slept poorly. In the morning, I got a call from the man who'd brought me the file. He told me to stop. Not angrily, not officially, just a quiet suggestion. The kind that carries weight because it doesn't need to explain itself. "You're digging into settled ground," he said. "There's nothing to overturn." "I'm not trying to overturn it," I said. "I'm trying to understand it." That's worse. "What would you have done in my place?" He didn't answer. I hung up and stared at the notebook, at the shape it was taking, at how many people had participated without ever agreeing to participate. Leonard Cross hadn't been killed. He'd been convinced that dying was the least destructive option available, and that meant the crime wasn't his death. It was everything that led up to it. By the end of that week, I knew something else, too. If I kept going, someone would try to stop me the same way they'd stopped him. Not with threats, with reasons, and once you accept those, you're already standing at the edge. By the time I reached the third week, the case stopped feeling like an investigation and started feeling like trespassing. Not in the legal sense, in the way you feel when a room goes quiet the moment you step into it. I noticed it first in the small things. A records clerk who suddenly needed written requests instead of casual ones. A phone that rang longer than it used to before anyone picked up. A patrol officer who recognized my name and pretended not to. Nobody told me to stop. They just made it harder to move. I went back to Leonard Cross's apartment. It had been emptied and repainted, like the city was trying to erase him with a roller. Beige walls, new locks, no smell left behind. The landlord hovered in the doorway, nervous. "They told me to clear it fast," he said. "Who's they?" "People from the city, said it was sensitive." "What would you have done in my place?" He swallowed. "Exactly what I did." I asked about Leonard's final days. Any visitors? Any unusual behavior? "There were men," he said. "Didn't look like cops. Wore suits like they weren't used to them. Polite. Too polite." "How many?" "2, maybe 3 different times. That wasn't in the file either. I drove downtown through rain thick enough to blur the streetlights into long yellow smears. The kind of night where reflections lie better than faces. I parked outside a municipal building that officially closed at 6 but never really slept. I wasn't welcome there anymore, but I still had a badge that hadn't expired yet. That counted for something. Not much. Inside, the halls echoed. My footsteps sounded louder than they should have. I found a clerk who still trusted me enough to look nervous on my behalf. "You're chasing the wrong kind of ghost," she said quietly. "I'm chasing a man who made a decision," I replied. "I want to know who helped him make it." She glanced at the ceiling, then slid a folder across the desk. No eye contact. Inside were notes from the inquiry that never made it into the official archive. Margin comments, suggested phrasings, revisions that softened conclusions without changing facts. That's how they do it. They don't lie, they dilute. One note stood out. "Witness exhibits signs of emotional fatigue. Recommend limiting exposure." That phrase appeared 3 times, same wording, different authors. It wasn't medical, it was administrative. I went looking for the psychologist who'd evaluated Leonard after the dam collapse. Private practice. Downtown office with soft lighting and neutral art meant to offend no one. She was careful. Professional. Defensive without being hostile. "I never declared him unstable," she said. "I said he was under prolonged stress." "You recommend he be removed from the inquiry?" "I recommended he not be overburdened." "And who decided what overburdened meant?" She hesitated. I didn't know my words would be used that way. They always say that. I asked about Leonard's state of mind near the end. "He felt cornered," she admitted. "Not suicidal. More resigned." Resigned was another safe word. It let everyone step back. "What would you have done in my place?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just looked at her hands. That night, I found my car window cracked, nothing stolen, glove compartment untouched, just a clean break in the glass, a reminder. I drove home slowly, watching headlights in the rear view. None followed long enough to matter. That was the point. Pressure without hands. The next morning, my supervisor called me in. He didn't yell, didn't threaten. He closed the door and spoke like a man trying to save me from myself. "You're chasing context," he said. "Context doesn't reopen cases. I'm not trying to reopen it. That's what scares people." "People who?" he sighed. "People who believe some outcomes are necessary." That was the closest anyone had come to saying it out loud. He told me there were budget reviews coming, that my position was discretionary, that retirement paperwork was easy if you didn't fight it. I listened. I nodded. I left. After that, the investigation nearly collapsed. Witnesses stopped returning calls. Files reminded me they'd already been requested. Access codes failed without explanation. The system wasn't attacking me, it was withdrawing oxygen. I went back to the bridge one last time. Midday this time. No rain, no shadows to hide in. I stood where Leonard had stood. The railing was higher than it looked in photos, solid, cold under my palms. Jumping wouldn't have been easy. I noticed scrape marks on the concrete, old, almost polished away, shoes sliding, hesitation. I imagined Leonard there, not alone. Someone beside him, not pushing, talking, explaining consequences, explaining responsibility, explaining how some truths destroy more than they save. I finally understood the genius of it. They didn't need to kill him. They needed him to believe he was the problem. When I got back to my office, there was a single envelope on my desk. No return address. Inside was a photocopy of Leonard's deposition outline. The original version. The one he'd never been allowed to give. Sections circled in red, notes in the margin. "This will hurt people who didn't cause the failure." That was the argument. Always had been. I sat there a long time, staring at it, realizing the investigation had been designed to exhaust me the same way it had exhausted him. That's when I made my mistake. I assumed the people applying pressure were trying to protect themselves. They weren't. They were trying to protect the idea that the system worked, and they would sacrifice anyone who threatened that belief. By the end of Act 3, I wasn't asking whether Leonard Cross had been forced to die. I was asking how many people had quietly agreed it was acceptable, and how close I was to joining them. By the time the truth started to surface, it didn't arrive like a confession. It arrived like paperwork. That's usually how it happens. No shouting, no dramatic reversals. Just documents that were never meant to be read together, finally laid side by side, revealing the negative space between them. I stopped chasing people. I started chasing signatures. Leonard Cross hadn't been powerful. That was the first mistake everyone made when trying to understand his death. He wasn't a whistleblower or a crusader. He wasn't brave in the cinematic sense. He was precise, methodical. A man who believed that if you did your job cleanly, the rest would sort itself out. Men like that don't expect to be crushed by the machinery they serve. They expect to be ignored. I spent 3 days inside the municipal archive building, a concrete block of a place with fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects trapped behind glass. The kind of building that smells faintly of dust, toner, and old ambition. I signed in as a consultant. No one questioned it. Titles still open doors if they sound boring enough. I pulled contracts, engineering approvals, safety variance requests, meeting minutes from committees whose members barely remembered attending them, and slowly a shape emerged. Not a conspiracy. That word is too dramatic, too intentional. This was Something quieter, a pattern of consent. The dam project had been rushed. Everyone knew that. Seasonal funding windows, political pressure, a mayor who wanted a ribbon cutting before election season. None of that was illegal. What mattered were the substitutions: cheaper concrete mix, thinner reinforcement in non-load-bearing sections that quietly became load-bearing once the design changed. Inspection. Timelines shortened by days that didn't look important until they stacked. Leonard Cross had objected. Not loudly, not publicly. He'd sent memos, dozens of them, each one carefully worded, each one ending with the same sentence, almost verbatim. I cannot sign off on this revision without further verification. Those memos went up the chain, and then they disappeared. Not deleted, filed, misplaced in a way only bureaucracy can manage. I found references to them in meeting summaries, phrases like concerns noted and further discussion deferred. Deferred until when? Until there was nothing left to discuss. Leonard's final inspection report was the only one with his actual signature. Not a stamped version, not a delegated approval, just his name. That made him useful, and then it made him dangerous. The deposition he'd been scheduled to give wasn't about the collapse. That was already settled. Officially, the failure was attributed to unexpected hydrological stress, an act of nature. The deposition was about process, who knew what, when they knew it, and who decided it wasn't worth slowing down. That kind of testimony doesn't send people to prison. It sends them into early retirement, quiet resignations, boardrooms that suddenly don't return calls. It unravels reputations. Leonard had finally understood that. Not that he was guilty, but that he'd been positioned to absorb the blame so everyone else could walk away clean. The city needed a conclusion. He was it. I tracked down a junior engineer who'd worked under Leonard, young then, older now, still carried himself like someone waiting to be told he'd done something wrong. We met in a bar near the river, midday, empty except for us and the bartender who pretended not to listen. He wasn't planning to die, the engineer said without preamble. I didn't interrupt. He was angry, the man continued, but not reckless. He told me he was finally ready to stop being careful. What changed? I asked. The engineer took a sip. He realized the process was the crime. That was the phrase. Process. Leonard wasn't going to expose a single decision. He was going to expose how dozens of reasonable people had agreed to do unreasonable things one at a time without ever feeling responsible. That terrified them. Did he tell anyone? I asked. The engineer nodded. He told his supervisor and someone from the city legal office. Names? He hesitated, then gave them. I already knew one. The other took more effort. City council. A man who specialized in risk mitigation. Translation. Making sure liability flowed downhill. I requested his calendar from that week. Public record. No resistance. There was a meeting listed the night Leonard died. No subject. Just initials. I cross-referenced badge logs from the municipal garage near the bridge. 2 entries within 15 minutes of each other. Leonard Cross and City Council. I went to see him. He was polished, calm, genuinely confused to see me. Leonard's death was a tragedy, he said, hands folded neatly on his desk. But it was also inevitable. That's a strong word, I replied. He was under immense pressure. Pressure from whom? From reality, he said smoothly. From consequences. I asked about the meeting. He didn't deny it. Yes, we spoke. Leonard was distressed. I tried to explain that the inquiry wouldn't benefit from speculative testimony. Speculative, I repeated. He wanted to imply intent where there was only systemic inertia. That system had names, I said, and signatures. He leaned back. You're framing this as malice. It wasn't. It was risk management. I let that sit. Then I asked the question he hadn't prepared for. Did you suggest resignation? A flicker. Of course, he said. It would have protected him. From what? From being made an example of. I nodded. And when he refused? Silence. He said he couldn't live with it anymore, the man said finally. I told him no one was asking him to. But you didn't tell him they'd protect him if he testified, I said. The man looked at me carefully. No, he said, because that wouldn't have been true. That was the moment the case broke open, not because he admitted guilt, because he admitted inevitability. Leonard had been presented with two futures, one where he spoke and watched everything he'd built get erased, including himself, and one where he disappeared quietly and allowed the system to remain intact. I asked the man if he'd gone to the bridge. He nodded. Did you push him? I asked. No. Did you stop him? No. That was the crime. They didn't need to force Leonard. They needed to stand there long enough to make sure he understood his options. I went back to the bridge again that night. Rain falling straight down. No wind. The river black and patient below. I stood where Leonard had stood. I imagined a man beside him, not threatening, just explaining. Explaining pensions, legal exposure, media cycles, explaining how the story would be told, explaining how no one would remember the details, only the outcome. I realized then why the case felt so empty. There was no murderer. There were accomplices, dozens of them, people who nodded, who deferred, who signed, who reassured themselves it wasn't their responsibility. Leonard Cross didn't jump because he was weak. He jumped because he finally understood the system wouldn't let him leave any other way. I wrote my report carefully. No accusations, no dramatics, just timelines, documents, meeting logs, language comparisons. I sent it to oversight, to the state, to anyone who would have to read it before ignoring it. The official conclusion didn't change. Cause of death remained suicide, but the inquiry expanded. Careers stalled, promotions paused, projects delayed. No one went to prison, but the system flinched, and sometimes that's the only victory you get. As for me, I closed the file, not because it was resolved, but because I finally understood it. Leonard Cross hadn't been killed. He'd been outvoted, quietly, methodically, and with everyone telling themselves they hadn't pushed. What would you have done in my place? By the time I returned to Greyhaven for the final leg of the case, the town had taken on the quiet weight of its own secrets. Rain streaked down the windows of my motel room, a persistent reminder that the world outside could be both soft and unforgiving at once. I spent the first hour reviewing every document, every margin note, every slightly altered date I had collected from archives, former colleagues, and the few people willing to speak to me. The ledger of Leonard Cross's life, and particularly of his final days, was no longer a collection of facts. It had become a blueprint of human complicity. I started with the bridge itself, the Harrow Bridge. I had walked its span countless times in my investigation, each time noticing something new in its cold steel lines and rain-slicked surfaces. The railing, the worn concrete, the water dark and patient below. I revisited every detail, the scuff marks near the edge, the exact placement of Leonard's shoes, the angles from which security cameras would or would not have caught a silhouette. I tried to imagine the sequence of the final hours, not to reconstruct a death, but to understand the human forces that had pushed him there without a single hand touching him. The realization settled like a stone in my stomach. This was a case of absence, of moral pressure so precise it left no trace of violence, no fingerprints, no confessions. Just the suffocating weight of expectation. I spent the morning interviewing witnesses I had already spoken to, hoping repetition might loosen something new. The city employees, former colleagues, and municipal engineers all had a habit of speaking carefully, of trimming their words just enough to obscure the truth while remaining technically honest. They were professionals at minimizing liability, and that same professionalism had ultimately orchestrated Leonard's exit. None of them had wanted him dead. None had intended harm in the conventional sense, yet all had contributed to an environment that left him with only one rational option. I recorded every nuance of their speech, every hesitation, every carefully chosen phrase. Words mattered more than actions in this case, and I had learned to weigh them like scales. By midday, I turned my attention to the inquiry itself, the deposition Leonard had been scheduled to give, and the documents he had prepared but never presented. Those papers contained precise observations, cautious criticisms, and questions that could have unraveled years of bureaucratic convenience. I reviewed each line, each revision. Leonard had circled points, written notes in margins, and highlighted inconsistencies that, if exposed, would have forced the city to confront a pattern of negligence and cover-up stretching back to the dam collapse. These weren't explosive revelations. They weren't scandals that would have made headlines, but they were enough to make reputations crumble quietly, to disrupt careers, to show how carefully orchestrated administrative compliance had replaced true oversight. That realization made me understand why every player had subtly conspired to ensure Leonard remained silent, willingly or not. I revisited the supervisor who had been the last official person to see Leonard before he went to the bridge. His office overlooked the river, the same river where Leonard's life had ended, or more accurately, had been ended by the careful pressure of expectation. He greeted me with the same practiced calm, the kind that hides anxiety beneath layers of protocol. We discussed Leonard's work, the sequence of emails, the revisions, the subtle nudges. I asked him directly about the moment Leonard might have felt cornered, about who might have spoken with him, and what suggestions had been offered for temporary relief from the inquiry. His answers were careful, deliberately measured, and, in their measuredness, devastating. He confirmed everything without actually admitting anything. He, and everyone like him, had created a structure in which Leonard's only path forward seemed to be voluntary disappearance. No force, no coercion, just a consensus of expectation so complete that it functioned as effectively as any threat. I spent the afternoon visiting Leonard's former colleagues, going back to the offices and construction sites where he had spent the final months of his life. Each person had their story, their version of events, and each story dovetailed with others in ways that were almost too perfect. A comment from a junior engineer here, a memo from a senior official there, a passing remark from a city lawyer in another office. They all added up to a network of silent pressure. It was bureaucracy as weapon and cage at once. Leonard's competence and integrity had turned him into a threat, not through action, but by refusing to accept convenient half-truths. That refusal had been enough to make everyone around him adjust subtly, creating a moral trap that left him with only one seemingly rational choice. I reviewed his personal life next. The ex-wife, distant and polite, confirmed details of his routine, his habits, the quiet, obsessive care with which he approached his work. Friends corroborated the pattern. Leonard had been meticulous, orderly, precise, a man incapable of rushing or skipping steps in his own conduct, yet suddenly forced into a world where skipping steps and ignoring inconsistencies was demanded of him. Even his drinking had not changed drastically. It had simply provided him the ability to stand back, observe, and calculate. The control that others exerted over him had made his careful nature a liability. Each small adjustment, each suggestion to take time off, each minor administrative correction had nudged him closer to the edge. Not literally, but conceptually. The edge of moral and professional possibility. That is often more compelling than a hand at your back. Late that afternoon, I returned to the city archives, to the same fluorescent-lit halls where I had begun Act 4. This time, I was not searching for documents. I was searching for absence, the gaps, the erased comments, the missing memos. I reconstructed timelines from what remained, cross-referencing with security logs, emails, and archived meeting minutes. The pattern was unmistakable. Leonard had been under systematic influence from nearly every tier of the municipal hierarchy. Supervisors, lawyers, engineers, even casual administrative staff. No one had struck him. No one had threatened him. They had all merely done their jobs, and in doing so they had applied an invisible, irresistible pressure that left him with one coherent exit strategy: walk off the bridge and disappear from their world. The realization weighed heavily on me. It was the kind of crime you can't prosecute. Not because there is no evidence, but because the evidence is entirely legal, entirely defensible, and entirely human. This was moral engineering, not murder. It was a crime of omission and tacit consensus, a networked complicity that relied on each participant's sense of propriety, their instinct to defer responsibility, their unspoken desire to protect themselves from scrutiny. Leonard's death was not only avoidable, it was predictable. And in its predictability lay the horror. I visited the bridge again that evening. Heavy rain fell in long vertical sheets, blurring the city lights into ribbons that floated across the asphalt and steel. The river beneath was swollen with autumn runoff, dark, patient, and indifferent. I ran my hand along the wet railing, imagining Leonard's final moments not as a leap into water, but as a concession to every silent instruction he had ever received. I envisioned the network of people, each subtly urging him toward the conclusion that would solve their collective problem. None of them had touched him. None had said a word about death. Their crime was consensus. Their instrument was obligation. Night fell. I returned to the motel, the city streets slick with rain and glowing with streetlights. I spread all of my documents across the table: memos, emails, meeting minutes, autopsy reports, engineering revisions, witness statements, personal notes, and my own observations. The case had grown from a man's death into a complex map of moral compromise and professional duty. Each page revealed how ordinary people, doing ordinary jobs with ordinary diligence, could collectively engineer a result so devastating that a competent, conscientious individual had no choice but to disappear. I did what I always do in these situations. I wrote a detailed report, Not for public release, not for a press briefing. I wrote it for posterity, each fact recorded with meticulous care, each omission noted. I accounted for every document I had uncovered. I cross-referenced witness statements with what remained in the files. I annotated the inconsistencies. I created a narrative that explained how Leonard's final days unfolded, not as a singular act of despair, but as the culmination of a city's quiet, lawful, and relentless pressure. The next morning, I delivered the report to the appropriate oversight offices. I explained my findings. I told them there was no murder. There was no crime as the law defines it. There was only a systemic failure in human ethics, an orchestrated moral collapse enacted through 1,000 small decisions. The officials listened politely. They nodded. They thanked me. And I knew the report would be filed and never acted upon. They would preserve appearances, leave the system intact, and continue to avoid personal exposure. Leonard Cross's story would remain a cautionary footnote in their internal records. I left the office and walked the streets of Greyhaven, watching the rain fall into gutters and flow toward the river. The town looked unchanged, yet I could see the invisible cracks where integrity had been forced aside. Careers were quietly altered. Reputations were protected. Projects moved forward. Nothing had been restored. Nothing had been corrected. And Leonard Cross remained in every subtle way, both the cause and the consequence of it all. I drove back along the river road at dusk, fog rolling in from the water, headlights reflecting on the wet asphalt. I reflected on my own role in this case, the decisions I had made, the paths I had followed, the truths I had exposed. The outcome had not been justice, not in the conventional sense. There had been no reckoning, no confession, no court-martial, no public satisfaction. Yet I had seen the invisible architecture of responsibility, and I had documented it. In a sense, that was all I could do. Bear witness, record the system for what it was, and survive it. By the time I returned to my apartment, night had fallen completely. I lit a cigarette, the smoke curling toward the ceiling. Outside, the rain continued to fall, indifferent, steady, relentless. I looked out at the city, thinking about Leonard Cross, about the silent agreements, the unseen pressures, the legal and moral compromises. I understood now why the case stayed with me, why it haunted me in quiet hours. It was not the man who had died. It was the system that had forced him to that choice. And I knew that no matter how carefully I documented it, the system would endure, unchanged in its fundamental operation. Some cases leave scars you can see. Others leave scars you feel, lingering in your judgment, your understanding of what it means to be human in a world governed by procedures, protocols, and polite forms of coercion. Leonard Cross's death was one of the latter. The city had not killed him. The law had not condemned him. No one had taken a weapon in anger. But the human capacity for indirect compulsion had carried him to the river all the same. That was what I had uncovered, and it was enough to leave a lasting impression. I put out the cigarette, took one last look at the rain-blurred cityscape. I closed the notebook, closed the file, and let it rest. I would never forget what I had learned about Leonard Cross, about Greyhaven, about the quiet violence of human systems and the fragility of individual choice within them. I would never forget that lesson. And what's the strangest case you ever heard of? I'd like to read your stories in the comments.